The evening rush at Golden Dragon Restaurant was like any other Tuesday night. The faded red and gold wallpaper had seen thousands of such evenings, each leaving behind a thin layer of time that dulled its once bright colors. Steam rose from the kitchen doors in gentle clouds, carrying the aroma of ginger and garlic through the dining room, while the clink of plates and murmur of conversation created the familiar symphony of restaurant life. Behind the swinging kitchen doors, Maya wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, careful not to disturb the few strands of gray hair that had escaped her neat bun. She had been on her feet for 12 hours already, but the night was far from over. Her worn shoes squeaked slightly against the linoleum floor as she balanced 3 plates of hot and sour soup on her left arm, a skill perfected over 15 years of service. The restaurant itself told a story of faded glory. In the corner stood a grand piano, its mahogany surface catching the dim light from paper lanterns overhead. Once, this had been the crown jewel of downtown's dining scene, where businessmen in sharp suits would bring their clients for power lunches, and families would celebrate special occasions amid the sparkle of crystal glasses. Now, the crystal had been replaced with standard restaurant-grade glassware, and the clientele was more likely to be hurried office workers or students looking for a quick meal. Mai moved between the tables with the grace of someone who knew every creaky floorboard, every wobbly table leg. She could tell which customers wanted to chat and which preferred to be left alone, which ones would need extra napkins before they asked, and which ones would complain about the spice level no matter how mild the dish was ordered. More tea? She would ask, already knowing the answer from the way people held their cups. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying just far enough to be heard over the restaurant's ambient noise. Some regulars had been coming for so long they didn't even need to order anymore. May remembered each preference, each allergic restriction, each special request. Near the kitchen, old Mr. Wu sat at his usual corner table, slowly stirring his wonton soup. He had been coming to Golden Dragon every Tuesday for the past decade, ever since his wife passed away. Mai knew he wasn't really there for the food. He came for the company, for the familiar faces, for the feeling of belonging somewhere. The grand piano stood like a silent guardian, watching over the dining room. Most customers probably thought it was just for show, a leftover piece from grander times that was too heavy or too expensive to move. Its presence was so constant that it had become almost invisible, like the faded Chinese paintings on the walls or the slightly crooked chopstick holder at table 7. Few people noticed how May's eyes would drift to the piano during quiet moments, or how her fingers sometimes moved in small patterns against her order pad, as if playing invisible keys. Even fewer knew that under the layer of dust, the piano was perfectly tuned, maintained in secret during the early morning hours before the restaurant opened. The dinner rush began to slow as the evening wore on. A young couple lingered over their fortune cookies, sharing quiet laughs as they rid their fortunes to each other. An elderly man carefully packed his leftover kung pao chicken into a takeout container, making sure to get every last peanut. The kitchen staff's calls became less urgent, and the clash of walks against burners grew less frequent. May's feet ached, and her back reminded her that she wasn't as young as she used to be. But there was a contentment in her movements, a sense of purpose that went beyond just serving food. She was part of people's stories, their first dates, their business deals, their family celebrations. She knew that tomorrow she would do it all again, carrying plates and pouring tea and smiling at customers' jokes she'd heard 100 times before. What none of them knew was that after the last customer left, after the floors were mopped and the kitchen cleaned, after old Mr. Wu had waved goodbye and shuffled into the night, May would have her own special moment. But that was still hours away, and right now, Table 12 needed their check, and Table 7 was ready to order, and the endless dance of restaurant life continued under the warm glow of paper lanterns. The clock on the wall struck 11, and the last customer pushed through the glass doors of Golden Dragon, leaving behind the faint jingle of bells. Mai moved through her closing routine with practiced ease, wiping down tables, counting the day's tips, and helping the kitchen staff store leftovers. But tonight, like every night for the past 15 years, her heart beat a little faster as closing time approached. In the kitchen, old Mr. Chen scrubbed the last of the pots, his weathered hands moving slowly but deliberately through the soapy water. Most people saw him as just the elderly dishwasher, but Mai knew better. Before his stroke 10 years ago, he'd had taught music at the city's most prestigious art school. Now, his right hand sometimes trembled too much to hold a conductor's baton, but his ear for music remained as sharp as ever. "Go on," he said to Mai in their native language, nodding toward the dining room. I can hear the piano calling. His eyes twinkled with understanding, the same way they had the first time he caught her playing after hours. Instead of reporting her to the owner, he had pulled up a chair and listened, tears streaming down his face as she played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Mai walked to the piano, her steps quiet on the old carpet. The restaurant felt different after hours, peaceful, almost magical, as if the walls themselves were waiting for what would come next. She lifted the heavy wooden cover, revealing keys that gleamed ivory and ebony in the dim light. Her fingers traced them lightly, remembering a time when these same fingers had danced across similar keys in a grand concert hall back home. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the empty restaurant. Mai closed her eyes, letting muscle memory guide her hands. The music started softly, like a secret being whispered, then grew stronger, more confident. Each note carried a story. Of the scholarship she'd won to the Shanghai Conservatory at age 16, of the standing ovations at her early performances, of the dreams she'd carefully packed away when her parents fell ill and needed her support. In the kitchen, Mr. Chen stopped his work, letting the last pot soak as he shuffled to his usual listening spot. He sat in the corner booth, eyes closed, conducting with his good hand as Mai played. Sometimes she wondered if he saw his own lost dreams in her music, the students he'd never get to teach, the orchestras he'd never conduct again. The music swelled, filling every corner of the restaurant. Mai's fingers flew across the keys, drawing out the complex emotions hidden in each measure. In these moments, she wasn't just a waitress with graying hair and tired feet. She was the musician she had always been, the artist who had once made audiences hold their breath in wonder. Outside, a few late-night passers-by stopped to listen through the glass, attracted by the unexpected sound of classical music flowing from what appeared to be a closed Chinese restaurant. Some took out their phones to record snippets, but most just stood there, swaying slightly, caught in the spell of the music. Inside, Mai lost herself in the piece, each note perfect despite years of serving dumplings instead of performing concertos. Her body swayed with the rhythm, and her face showed every emotion the music carried: joy, longing, determination, and a touch of sweet sadness. The restaurant's worn interior seemed to fade away, replaced by the grandeur of concert halls she had once dreamed of playing in. Mr. Chen watched her with pride, remembering his own days of discovering young talents. He knew that true musicians never really stopped being musicians, even if life led them down different paths. Every night, as Mai played, the restaurant became more than just a place that served food. It transformed into a secret concert hall where dreams refused to die. As the final notes faded into the quiet night, Mai's hands rested gently on the keys. For a moment, neither she nor Mr. Chen moved, letting the echo of the music settle around them like dust motes in the dim light. Then, as always, she carefully closed the piano cover and stood up, transforming back into the efficient waitress who would return tomorrow to serve another day of customers who had no idea of the magic that happened after hours. But tomorrow night would be different. Tomorrow night, fate would arrange a special performance that would change everything. Though neither Mai nor Mr. Chen could have guessed it as they locked up the restaurant and headed home under the glow of street lamps, their hearts still humming with the night's secret symphony. The private party arrived at 7 sharp, filling the Golden Dragon's largest table with designer suits and expensive perfumes. They were celebrating something big. May could tell from their loud laughter and the way they ordered the most expensive wines without glancing at the prices. Through snippets of conversation, she learned they were tech company executives who had just taken their company public. The party's leader, a young man with perfectly styled hair and a watch that probably cost more than May's yearly salary, took charge of ordering. "We'll start with your finest champagne," he announced, barely looking up from his phone. "And keep it flowing. We're making history tonight." Mai moved efficiently between the kitchen and their table, bringing out platters of dim sum and Peking duck. The group grew louder with each bottle of wine, their voices bouncing off the restaurant's walls and drowning out the quiet conversations of other diners. Mr. Chen watched from his kitchen window, his experienced eyes noting how Mai maintained her gentle smile even when they interrupted her mid-sentence or snapped their fingers to get her attention. "Hey, what's with the piano?" one of the women asked, pointing her chopsticks at the grand piano in the corner. "Seems kind of out of place in a Chinese restaurant, don't you think?" Her words were slightly slurred, her designer jacket now draped carelessly over her chair. The young man with the expensive watch swiveled in his chair, noticing the instrument for the first time. "Oh man, that thing must be ancient. Bet it hasn't been played since the Stone Age." The group erupted in laughter, several of them pulling out their phones to take pictures of the dusty piano. "I wonder if it even works," another executive chimed in, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. "Hey, maybe our waitress can play us a tune." More laughter followed, and several heads turned to look at May, who was quietly clearing their empty plates. The party's leader pulled out his wallet, making a show of extracting $100 bill. "What do you say?" he called out to Mai, waving the money in the air. "How about a little entertainment? Something simple, maybe chopsticks." His colleagues snickered, some of them already pulling out their own phones to record what they assumed would be an amusing spectacle. In the kitchen, Mr. Chen's hands tightened around the plate he was washing. Through the serving window, he could see Mai standing perfectly still, a half-cleared plate in her hands. The restaurant had grown oddly quiet, other diners uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before them. "Come on," the young man pressed, slapping the $100 bill on the table. "Show us what you can do, unless you're scared." His words carried a sharp edge beneath their playful tone, and his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Mai carefully set down the plates she was holding. 15 years of nights spent with Chopin and Rachmaninoff seemed to hover in the air around her. She could feel Mr. Chen's eyes on her back, could sense the mix of concern and anticipation radiating from him. The young executives were still laughing, making exaggerated gestures of conducting with their chopsticks. They had no idea that the woman they were mocking had once made concert halls fall silent with her talent, that her fingers knew every note of pieces they probably couldn't even pronounce. For a moment, May thought of all the nights she played in secret, of the dreams she tucked away as carefully as she folded the restaurant's napkins. She thought of Mr. Chen, who had lost his ability to make music but never lost his love for it. She thought of her parents, long gone now, who had needed her to choose responsibility over passion. The $100 bill lay on the table like a challenge, but it wasn't about the money. It was about all the moments that led to this one, all the music that had been waiting to be heard. With slow, deliberate movements, May removed her serving apron and folded it neatly, placing it on an empty table. The restaurant seemed to hold its breath as she turned toward the piano, her step steady and purposeful. The young executives exchanged gleeful looks, expecting entertainment of an entirely different kind than what they were about to receive. None of them noticed Mr. Chen emerging from the kitchen, positioning himself near the door with a knowing smile on his weathered face. He alone knew what was coming, and he couldn't wait to see their expressions when they realized just how wrong they had been. Time seemed to slow down in the Golden Dragon as May stood between the tables, her order pad clutched in one hand. The weight of 15 years pressed against her chest. 15 years of quiet playing in an empty restaurant, of keeping her talent hidden like a precious secret, of being just the waitress who brought hot and sour soup and fortune cookies to countless tables. The $100 bill still lay on the table, crisp and green under the restaurant's aging lights. But May wasn't seeing it anymore. Instead, she was seeing flashes of her past. Her first piano recital at age 6, her mother's proud tears when she got accepted to the conservatory, the last concert she gave before having to leave it all behind. The memories swirled around her like autumn leaves in a gentle wind. From the kitchen doorway, Mr. Chen watched with bated breath. He could read the battle in her stance, the way her shoulders tensed, the slight tremor in her hands that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with 15 years of holding back. He remembered the first time he'd heard her play after hours, how the music had brought him to tears, reminding him of his own days conducting orchestras before the stroke changed everything. The young executives were still chuckling, some typing on their phones, others making jokes about what song she might attempt to play. "Maybe she'll give us Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," one of them said, causing another burst of laughter. They were so caught up in their own amusement that they didn't notice how the other diners had grown quiet, sensing that something important was about to happen. May's fingers moved slightly at her side, playing invisible keys, a habit she'd never quite broken. The same fingers that had just cleared dirty dishes and carried heavy trays still remembered every note of Rachmaninoff's most challenging pieces. They remembered the feel of silk piano keys in concert halls, the thunder of applause, the joy of bringing beautiful music into the world. She looked down at her worn uniform, spotted with tiny stains from years of service. How many times has she smoothed this apron, straightened this name tag, played her part as the quiet, efficient waitress? The role had become comfortable, like a well-worn shoe, but suddenly it felt too tight, too confining. An elderly couple sitting near the window caught her eye. They were regulars who came every Wednesday for the curry chicken. The woman gave Mai a small, encouraging nod, as if she somehow understood what was happening. At another table, a young student who always ordered the cheapest noodle dish looked up from his textbook, sensing the tension in the air. Mr. Chen took a step forward, his good hand gripping the doorframe. He knew what Mai was capable of, had heard her pour her heart out through those piano keys night after night. He wanted to say something, to encourage her, but he knew this moment belonged to her alone. The restaurant's old clock ticked steadily on the wall, marking each second of hesitation. Through the front windows, the city lights twinkled, and cars passed by, unaware of the drama unfolding inside the modest Chinese restaurant. The smell of ginger and garlic still hung in the air, mixing with the lingering aroma of expensive wine from the executive party's table. Mai felt something shift inside her, like a key turning in a lock. She thought of all the nights she played in secret, of Mr. Chen's quiet appreciation, of the music that had never stopped flowing through her heart despite everything life had thrown her way. She thought of her parents, who had needed her help all those years ago, and wondered if maybe they would want her to reclaim this piece of herself now. With movements that felt both foreign and completely natural, May began untying her apron. The familiar motions she performed thousands of times at the end of each shift now felt different, more significant. She folded the apron with the same care she'd always shown, smoothing out the wrinkles one last time. The young executive who had offered the $100 raised his eyebrows, surprised that she was actually going to attempt to play. His friends nudged each other, phones at the ready to capture what they assumed would be an embarrassing moment worthy of their social media feeds. But as Mai placed her folded apron on a nearby table and turned toward the piano, there was something in her walk that made a few of them pause, their smiles faltering slightly. Her steps were sure and graceful, like those of someone walking onto a stage rather than a waitress accepting a dare. Mr. Chen smiled, knowing that everyone in the restaurant was about to discover what he had known all along, that sometimes the most extraordinary things hide in the most ordinary places. The sound of May's footsteps seemed unusually loud as she approached the grand piano. The usual restaurant noises, the clink of dishes, the murmur of conversation, the sizzle from the kitchen, had all faded to silence. Even the group of executives had quieted down, though a few still wore amused smirks as they held up their phones to record. Mai lifted the piano cover with the same gentle care she'd shown thousands of times before, but this time she wasn't alone in the empty restaurant after hours. The ivory keys gleamed under the dim lighting, like old friends waiting to share a secret. She adjusted the bench with practiced ease, her movements fluid and natural, already different from the hurried efficiency she showed while serving tables. The young executive who had offered the $100 leaned forward, wine glass in hand. "Remember, chopsticks is fine if that's all you know," he called out, his voice carrying a mix of condescension and amusement. A few of his colleagues chuckled, but the sound was quieter now, less certain. Mai sat at the piano, her back straight, her hands resting lightly on her lap. For a moment, she closed her eyes, and in that brief darkness, she was back in the Shanghai Conservatory, preparing for her final recital. The memory was so clear, she could almost smell the polish on the concert hall's wooden floors. When her fingers touched the keys, the restaurant ceased to exist. The first notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the air, not tentative or apologetic, but strong and sure, like a river that had finally broken through a dam. The complex melody poured from her fingers as naturally as breathing, years of practice and passion flowing through every note. The change in the room was instant and electric. Wine glasses stopped halfway to lips. Phones lowered slowly, their owners forgetting to press record. The young executive's smirk froze, then melted away into pure astonishment. Near the kitchen, Mr. Chen closed his eyes, tears already beginning to form at the corners. May's hands danced across the keys, drawing out the piece's deep emotions, the longing, the triumph, the bittersweet beauty that Rachmaninoff had woven into every measure. The old piano, which many had assumed was just for show, rang out with a richness that filled every corner of the restaurant. Other diners had put down their chopsticks and turned in their seats. The elderly couple by the window held hands, swaying slightly to the music. A young family with 2 children sat mesmerized, their half-eaten dumplings forgotten. Even the busy kitchen staff had stopped their work, gathering at the doorway to watch. The music built in intensity, May's fingers flying over the keys with perfect precision. Each note was crisp and clear, each phrase shaped with the skill of a true artist. The piece's famous melody soared above the harmonies, telling a story of hidden dreams and unexpected moments of grace. Through the front windows, passers-by began to stop and stare. Some pressed their faces against the glass, amazed to see a waitress in a worn uniform creating such magnificent music. A small crowd gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the sound of classical music flowing from what appeared to be a simple Chinese restaurant. The young executives sat in stunned silence, their earlier mockery forgotten. One of them had tears running down her face, though she didn't seem to notice. Another kept shaking his head slowly, as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had assumed just minutes before. As Mai played the concerto's most challenging passages, her face reflected every emotion in the music. There was no hint of the quiet, efficient waitress now. In her place sat an artist lost in her craft, sharing a piece of her soul through each note. Her usual gentle smile had transformed into an expression of complete joy and freedom. Mr. Chen watched from his spot near the kitchen, his good hand conducting slightly in the air. He saw in May's performance everything he had lost to his stroke, but there was no bitterness in his heart, only pride and a deep satisfaction at seeing true talent finally recognized. The music filled the restaurant like sunlight, transforming the modest space into a concert hall. The worn carpets, the faded wallpaper, the slight scuff marks on the walls, none of it mattered anymore. In that moment, the Golden Dragon became a place where magic was real and dreams refused to stay hidden. And still May played on, each note perfect, each phrase building on the last, creating a moment that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. the night they learned that sometimes the most extraordinary music comes from the most unexpected places. When the final notes of Rachmaninoff's concerto faded into the stillness of the restaurant, no one moved. The silence that followed was profound, the kind of quiet that happens when people are afraid to breathe, afraid to break the spell that has fallen over them. May's hands rested gently on the keys, her eyes still closed, living in that magical space between the last note and the return to reality. Then, like a wave building from the depths, applause erupted throughout the Golden Dragon. It started with the elderly couple by the window and spread quickly, growing into a thunderous standing ovation. People who had come for a simple dinner were on their feet, cheering with tears in their eyes. The kitchen staff emerged fully from their hidden spots, their white aprons dotted with cooking stains, clapping with unrestrained joy. Among the young executives, the transformation was complete. Gone were the smirks and condescending glances, replaced by expressions of wonder and, in many cases, shame. The $100 bill lay forgotten on the table, now seeming like an insult rather than a challenge. The young man who had offered it stood up, his face flushed with embarrassment and awe. But it was one of his companions who moved first, a quiet man who had been sitting at the far end of the table, saying little during their earlier mockery. He walked toward the piano with purpose, his eyes bright with recognition. He stopped a respectful distance from Mai and waited until she opened her eyes. "I'm a producer at Rising Sun Studios," he said softly, his voice carrying in the now hushed restaurant. "We specialize in recording classical musicians, particularly those from Asian backgrounds." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What you just played. I haven't heard an interpretation of Rachmaninoff with that much soul in years." Mr. Chen had made his way closer to the piano, his good hand clutching a kitchen towel that he'd been using to wipe away tears. He watched as the producer pulled out a business card and placed it gently on the piano. "We've been looking for artists who bring something unique to classical music," the producer continued. "Not just technical skill, but real emotion, real-life experience. Would you consider recording with us?" Mai looked at the business card, then at Mr. Chen, who nodded encouragingly. The restaurant had gone quiet again, everyone waiting to hear her response. The other diners, the kitchen staff, even the people still pressed against the windows from outside. They had all become part of this moment. The young executive who had started it all stepped forward. His earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by genuine regret. "We owe you an apology," he said, looking down at his expensive shoes. "We acted like fools. What you just played it was beautiful. More than beautiful. It was a gift." Mai finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Music has always been my gift," she said, running her fingers lightly over the keys. "I never stopped being a musician, even when life took me in a different direction." She looked around the restaurant, at the worn tables she had served for 15 years, at the kitchen where Mr. Chen had encouraged her to keep playing, at the faces of customers who now saw her in a completely different light. Other members of the executive party began sharing the videos they'd recorded, not as mockery now, but as a way to preserve something extraordinary. Their phones lit up with notifications as the clips began spreading across social media. The Waitress pianist, someone had already dubbed her, and the name was catching on. The producer stepped closer, his enthusiasm growing. "We could do a whole series. Classical pieces performed in unexpected places by unexpected people. Your story, your talent. It breaks down every stereotype about who can make great music and where it can be found." Mai touched the business card lightly, as if making sure it was real. She thought about all the nights she'd played alone in this room with only Mr. Chen as her audience. She thought about her parents, who had needed her to choose family over fame. She thought about how life sometimes takes us on long detours before bringing us back to our dreams. Through the windows, the city lights twinkled, and more people were gathering, drawn by the videos that were already circulating online. Inside, the restaurant had become more than just a place that served Chinese food. It had become the birthplace of something new, something that challenged people's assumptions about talent, about dreams, and about the extraordinary possibilities hiding in ordinary places. 6 months later, the Golden Dragon had become something entirely new. The worn carpet had been replaced, the wallpaper refreshed, but the heart of the place remained the same. The most noticeable change was the grand piano, now polished to a mirror shine and positioned prominently in the center of the dining room. Mai still wore an apron and carried plates of steaming food to hungry customers, but everything else had shifted. The restaurant now had two menus, one for food and one for music. Every evening at 8 o'clock, she would wipe her hands on her apron, walk to the piano, and transform the humble Chinese restaurant into a unique concert venue. Her first album, recorded at Rising Sun Studios, sat proudly on display near the entrance. Titled After Hours, it featured all the pieces she had played in secret over the years. The cover showed Mai in her waitress uniform, sitting at the grand piano, her face peaceful and proud. The album wasn't topping any charts, but it had found its audience. People who understood that great music, like great food, could come from unexpected places. Mr. Chen had become something of a local celebrity himself. Though he could no longer play or conduct, his keen musical ear made him the perfect host for their nightly concerts. He would tell customers about each piece Mai was about to play, sharing stories about the composers and the history behind the music. His enthusiasm was infectious, and even people who had never listened to classical music found themselves drawn into the world he described. The young executives who had once mocked Mai became regular customers, but now they came with humility and genuine appreciation. The $100 bill that had started it all was framed on the wall, along with a handwritten apology that had become part of the restaurant's story. It served as a reminder that sometimes life's most beautiful moments come from its most difficult challenges. The restaurant's new format had sparked something unexpected in the community. Local music students began asking if they could practice there during off hours. Mai and Mr. Chen started offering Sunday afternoon sessions where aspiring musicians could play for customers, earning both experience and tips. The Golden Dragon had become a place where dreams were not just served with food, but nurtured with understanding. On busy nights, people would line up outside, waiting for a chance to eat good Chinese food while listening to world-class classical music. Tourist websites began featuring the restaurant as a must-visit spot, describing it as a place where culture and cuisine blended in perfect harmony. Food critics wrote about how the music seemed to make the food taste better, and music critics praised the unique atmosphere that made classical music feel accessible and alive. Mai's story spread beyond the city, inspiring others to share their hidden talents. News programs ran features about other working people who harbored extraordinary abilities. The bus driver who was a master painter, the janitor who wrote poetry, the grocery clerk who could solve complex mathematical equations. Mai's courage in revealing her gift had sparked a movement of people refusing to let their dreams stay silent. But the most beautiful changes were the small ones. Regular customers now knew to request their favorite pieces along with their favorite dishes. Children who came in for family dinners would sit mesmerized by the piano, some beginning to take lessons themselves. The elderly couple who had been there on that fateful night celebrated their 50th anniversary at the restaurant, dancing slowly to Mai's playing of Chopin's Nocturne. The producers at Rising Sun Studios had been right. Mai's way of playing classical music was unique precisely because of her life experience. Every piece she performed carried the weight of her journey, the years of serving others while keeping her passion alive, the wisdom of knowing that no dream is ever truly lost, just waiting for its moment to shine. One evening, as Mai finished playing Rachmaninoff's concerto, the piece that had changed everything, a young waitress from another restaurant came up to her. "I've been taking art classes in secret," she whispered. "Watching you inspired me to keep going." Mai smiled, understanding perfectly. She had learned that talent doesn't fade just because life takes unexpected turns, and that sometimes the longest detours lead us exactly where we need to be. The Golden Dragon had become more than just a restaurant that offered dinner and a show. It had become a symbol of hope, a place where people came not just to eat and listen, but to believe in second chances and hidden possibilities. Every night, as Mai played her beloved piano while wearing her serving apron, she proved that there is no expiration date on dreams, and that life's most beautiful music often comes from embracing all the parts of who we are.